Have you ever stopped to think about how like really know, the difference between right and wrong? It feels so baked into who we are, right? Almost instinctual. But the journey of how we actually develop that inner moral compass, well, that's one of the most fascinating stories in all of psychology.
So let's just get right to the heart of it. The big question. Is our sense of morality something we're just born with, a kind of factory setting? Or is it something we actually construct, piece by piece, over our entire lives? That's what we're going to dig into today, how we each build our own moral compass.
Okay, so the official term for this whole process is moral development. And it's not just one simple thing. It's really about the changes in how we think, how we feel, and what we do when it comes to right and wrong. It's got this private, internal side, your personal code, and then there's the social side, the part that helps us navigate our relationships with other people.
To really get our heads around this, we're going to look at 4 key building blocks. First up, how we think about right and wrong. Then we'll get into the role of our feelings and, our actual actions. Third, we'll explore how morality becomes a core part of our identity. And finally, we'll look at the places where our moral compass really gets its blueprints drawn. All right, let's jump into part 1, thinking. This is all about the machinery in our brains, the logic we use to make moral judgments. It's the why behind the choices we make. So, the legendary psychologist Jean Piaget, he noticed this really fascinating shift in how kids think. Little kids, from about 4 to 7, are in what he called the heteroautonomous stage. To them, rules are like the law of gravity. They're just there, and they can't be changed. So for them, accidentally breaking 10 glasses is way, way worse than intentionally breaking 1. It's all about the outcome. But then, as we get older, we shift to the autonomous stage. We realize, oh, wait, people make the rules, and suddenly the intention behind an action becomes way more important than the consequence. Now, building on Piaget's ideas, another psychologist, Lawrence Kohlberg, used these clever moral dilemmas to dig even deeper. You've probably heard of his most famous one, the Heinz dilemma. Long story short, his wife is dying, a greedy druggist has the only cure, and Heinz can't afford it, so he steals it. Now, here's the brilliant part. Kohlberg didn't actually care if you said Heinz should or shouldn't have stolen the drug. What he cared about was your reasoning, the why.
And that why showed him that we seem to move through 3 different levels of reasoning. At the first level, the pre-conventional, it's all about avoiding punishment or getting a reward. Pretty basic. Then we move into the conventional level. Here, it's about fitting in, upholding the law, and doing what's expected of you, like being a good husband. But at the highest level, the post-conventional, your reasoning is based on your own personal moral code, on universal principles like justice or the sanctity of life, which might even lead you to break the law.
But hold on. As influential as Kohlberg's theory was, it wasn't the final word, not by a long shot. People started pointing out some pretty big holes. For starters, there's a huge difference between thinking about what's right and actually doing it. Others, like Carol Gilligan, said it was totally gender biased, that it valued a typically male justice perspective over a more typically female care perspective. Plus, it really doesn't give much credit to our emotions, our gut reactions, and it turns out these stages don't seem to hold up in every single culture.
And all that talk about gut feelings, well, that leads us perfectly into our second building block, feeling and doing good. This is where we shift gears from just pure logic and look at the role of our emotions and our actual real-world behavior.
For a long time, the big idea came from Freud. He believed that our entire moral system was basically built on guilt. We develop this inner watchdog, the superego, that makes us feel bad to keep us in line. But more recently, the focus has really shifted. Psychologists now argue that positive feelings are just as important, maybe even more so. Things like empathy, where you literally feel with someone else, and sympathy are incredibly powerful drivers for doing the right thing.
This brings us to a really useful idea called the social cognitive theory of morality. And it makes this super simple but powerful distinction. On one hand, you have moral competence. That's knowing what to do. On the other hand, you have moral performance. That's actually doing it. See the difference? You might know it's wrong to lie, but whether you actually lie in a tough spot depends on a whole bunch of other things, like your self-control. Knowing isn't enough.
And get this, a classic study from way back in the 1920s just drives this point home. Researchers watched 11,000 children, giving them all sorts of chances to lie, cheat, or steal. And what did they find? That moral behavior was all over the place. It was totally situation dependent. A kid could be perfectly honest one minute and then cheat on a test the next. Their big conclusion? There was basically no such thing as a completely honest or a completely dishonest kid. Okay, so if our behavior can be so inconsistent, how do any of us become a genuinely good person? That brings us to our third section, becoming a moral person. This is about the who at our very core. This is where we talk about something called moral identity. And this is a huge step. It's the point when being honest or fair or kind becomes a central part of your self-concept. When you have a strong moral identity, doing something wrong doesn't just feel like you broke a rule. It feels like you betrayed yourself. It violates who you are. And working hand in hand with that is moral character. Think of it this way. If moral identity is the what, the values you hold, then moral character is the how. It's the strength, the persistence, the grit to actually follow through on those values, especially when it's hard. It's the engine that turns your moral identity into real-world action.
And if you want to see these two ideas in perfect harmony, you look to what we call moral exemplars. Rosa Parks is an absolutely perfect example. When she refused to give up her seat on that bus, it wasn't just about breaking an unfair rule. It was a powerful statement of her identity and an incredible display of moral character. Her actions flowed directly from a deep, unshakable sense of who she was and what was right.
So where do these incredible traits, identity and character, actually come from? That brings us to our final section, part 4, where morality is made. We're talking about the blueprints for our moral compass.
It turns out parents play an absolutely massive role. A researcher named Ross Thompson calls them moral mentors. And it's not just about discipline. A warm, secure, loving relationship is the foundation for everything. It's also about being proactive, helping kids navigate situations before they go wrong. And maybe most importantly, it's about having those rich, ongoing conversations about values, about feelings, and about why we do the things we do.
So what does this actually look like day to day? Well, the research gives us some really clear recommendations. Be warm and supportive, not harsh. Explain the why behind rules instead of just saying, because I said so. Let kids be part of family decisions. And of course, model the behavior you want to see. The whole goal is to help them build an internal compass, not just one that reacts to outside pressure.
But here's the thing. All of these individual blueprints are being drawn inside a much larger culture, and that culture has shifted dramatically. Just look at this data on what college freshmen say is important to them. Back in the early 70s, more than 80% said developing a meaningful philosophy of life was essential. By 2017, that had cratered to less than half. And at the exact same time, the goal of being very well off financially more than doubled. That is a massive shift in the cultural soil where we're all trying to grow our moral compasses. And that really leaves us with a final and pretty crucial question. In a world where values seem to be constantly shifting, how do we intentionally and consciously build a strong moral compass? How do we focus on the thinking, the feeling, the identity, and the environments that nurture not just what makes us successful, but what makes us good? That's something for all of us to really think about.